Hi there, I'm Caroline Brennan, and you're listening to a series called Stories. The story I bring you today is one about torture, internment, resilience, acceptance, and most important of all, healing. Paddy Joe McLean, hello and welcome to the programme.
Hello Caroline, thank you very much. I will tell you a story roughly about 40 years ago where I happened to be one of those who were picked up by the security forces, but through a week-long torture experience, and then interned in a place called Long Kesh. No longer there, but that's roughly where we start. And then from that point I'll go on to say how that affected me in the short term, how I came to see another way of it, and how eventually I've come to the present position where I am able to accept what happened, why it happened, the people who inflicted it, and at the same time I am able to live with myself without hatred, without feeling emotionally bad about the people who did that, understanding that they were doing a job that they were trained to do, and here I am speaking to you.
Paddy Joe, can we start at the beginning? I mean, why was it in the first instance that somebody decided to pick you up and to put you through a week of torture?
Well, that really is a comparatively simple question, because any government in the world, when there's unrest in their jurisdiction, they are going to do all in their power to quell that unrest. In our case here in Northern Ireland, internment had been used twice every century over the past 300 or 400 years. It mightn't have been called internment, but it was mass arrest. And it was seen to work, and it was seen to quell, in short term, the disturbance that had arisen. So that was just merely following that pattern. But we didn't see it that way at the time, because we hadn't been guilty of any crime. In fact, I had put in most of my political career up to that point speaking on anti-violence platforms, because I was chairman of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. Nobody in that association advocated violence. So, looking at it from the government's point of view, there were mass crowds out on the street. In fact, the Prime Minister of the day told me later that one of the reasons that I was interned was not that I was a gunman or supporter of a gunman, but that I was capable of bringing people out in the streets to object to what was being done if internment was introduced. I had that conversation with him person to person, and he told me that. And in a way that helped me to come to terms as well with what happened. So as to why governments do that because there's a mistaken belief that if they throw a security blanket over a problem, that it's solved. It is not solved. It is left there to fester, to re-emerge at a future date, and that has happened here.
We're talking 40 years ago. What happened 40 years ago?
You're talking 40 years ago, and it was just a year prior to that internment was introduced, and the people who had been preaching non-violence and who had been supporting it realised that the government had made a mistake, and they continued on by keeping mass crowds on the street, protesting now about the introduction of internment. And that culminated in the Bloody Sunday March, and what has become known as the Bloody Sunday March in Derry, because that march was called, and it was called by a Protestant girl who would nowadays be regarded as an extreme unionist. It was called and organised by her, in company of course with lots of others of mixed denominations, to protest about that injustice, because they realised that would never solve the problem here.
Were you picked up on the road? Was somebody knocking on your door? How did it come for you to be put into custody?
Now, I was a teacher, and I was just picked up by police coming to the door asking if they could speak with me, and I said I could, and they said, well, you can accompany us in the car, we're going down to the police station. Down to the police station, and from there off you went. It was all civilised. No brutality, nothing attached to it. But I didn't know at that time that internment, this order had been signed, and that I was actually on my way to the internment camp.
Okay, so you go to the internment camp. What was it like on your first sight of it?
At any time you had no less than 200-300 men packed on top of each other. In fact, thousands over the period inhabited those camps at one stage or another. It was a very strict regime, and it was supposed to be run strictly by prison authorities. But then, when so many men are lifted and put into those circumstances, they see it as their duty to devise how they'll live and how they'll organise and how they'll spend their time and what they'll learn. And there was about half a dozen teachers, and we sat down and we worked out a programme, the same as you would do in a college, so that every minute of every day was accounted for. And that would stretch to hygiene, food, exercise, all that.
And you organised all that yourselves?
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. So it actually meant that we were running the internment camp instead of the prison wardens and all that.
But you weren't really?
No, we weren't, but we were doing a lot of the manual tasks, and we made life easy for ourselves and for the prison wardens who were watching on and so on, doing their job all right.
And in terms of contact with family members, did that happen?
On family, you were allowed 2 visits per month, so that you could send the 2 out to your own family, or you could send out one to your family, one to your friend, or whatever. 2 per month.
And you know what, you're painting kind of a picture that looks like something that I'd see in the telly, you know, where, you know, all the prisoners come together, they organise themselves, they keep themselves well, physically, mentally. But it must have been hard, very bloody hard.
It was extremely difficult. The most difficult part has been separated from your people at home. That's a difficult thing at any time. In my case, the most difficult part for me was to realise that I was, even the terms that we talk about were rigid, strict, severe, even those were better than what my wife suffered at home. Because there she was, and we had a family of 8 at that time. No money coming into the house. She was left on her own to watch those children, to send them to school and all that. She had a far worse time than I had. And yet, I was accused of doing something wrong. She was never accused of that. So she was, by any standard, she and all other women like her, they were the actual sufferers from internment. We could cope. How were they expected to cope?
And when somebody wasn't coping inside in the camp, what would happen?
We had a prison hospital. We could send out for doctors. We had medical advice at all times. We had lots of willing hands, some who were nurses, male nurses. So if somebody became depressed and refused to get up out of bed, we'll say, as did happen, then we had volunteers who would volunteer to sit by the bedside and change places with each other and gradually lift that person's spirits. We looked after each other. There was a programme then secretly designed where certain internees, 12 of them in fact, were brought into a secret place that hasn't really been discovered yet and kept there without food, without drink, under white noise and so on, under constant interrogation to see what could be learned from them. I was one of those. Yeah. I did not know that anybody else was suffering the same as I was suffering. I thought I was the only one because we were kept separate. So I was completely isolated for a week and kept subject to all that abuse that went on.
What abuse are you talking about?
I'm talking about all sorts of physical abuse that you can imagine. The fact that we're put into boiler suits, for a start. They were army boiler suits. We were told we were going to be dropped into territory that wouldn't, and told that we were IRA men and so on, and would be slaughtered. Then we were subjected all the time to what became known as a white noise. It's the same noise as you would find from a jet aeroplane, you know, that high-pitched noise where you couldn't hear anything.
What was that like?
It would drive you insane. That was the biggest danger, becoming insane in there. And then scarcity of food, anything like that. And then wall standing. The various reports on that were found that we had to stand, you know, roughly the equivalent of 11 hours per day without any help or assistance. And in my case, I refused to do that. So I was handcuffed and then I was hung up on the wall, you know, to be made stand.
When you say hung up on the wall, what do you mean?
The chain that was keeping my wrists together was linked into a big nail on the wall behind me, and I was kept there. And then that led me then to refuse to speak. So things went from bad to worse until eventually you crumbled, and then water would be thrown on you to bring you round again.
So you're hanging there, yes, by your bounded hands, yes, with a chain and attached to a thing on the wall. The blood leaves your arms. You know, if you need to go to the toilet, you just literally just go there.
You weren't allowed to go to the toilet. You had to do whatever you had to do in your pants. That's true.
How long was that kind of hanging scenario lasted?
Well, there's no way you could judge that. I was judging the passage of time by the growth of my beard. That's all the way I could judge that. Because there was lights on all the time. You couldn't distinguish dark from night. You didn't know when it was breakfast time or dinner time or what time. It was just on and on and on. And
you're on your own, or you're given the impression you're on your own?
I never knew that there was anybody else in the same plight as I was until after that session was over and they decided to put me on a helicopter. And that helicopter eventually brought me to Crumlin Road Prison. And the first person I met was a warden that I knew. And he looked at me and I could see his eyes. And he told me afterwards that he thought that I was some sort of spirit. I'd failed so much and all that. So I went then, I was taken directly to the prison hospital. And there I got the best of treatment, food, warm bed, attendance by a doctor, and after about 6 days or so I was back on my feet in the prison, and from there on I eventually ended up in Long Kesh.
And so I'm just thinking in terms of that warden looking at you and actually thinking you're like an apparition because you looked so bloody awful. I'm trying to imagine, what was it that he saw when he clapped eyes on you that first time?
Well, he told me afterwards that he couldn't believe it was me until I called him by his name. And then he saw that that's who it was, and he couldn't believe that I had lost so much weight. I had lost a lot of weight. And my colour had gone out of my face. And I wasn't physically physically mobile enough to move as a young man, and that he knew should be moving. So he told me afterwards that he couldn't have believed, except he saw it. He couldn't believe that that would happen, or that would be inflicted by one human being on another.
You said, Paddy Joe, a while ago, the biggest danger was about, and the biggest fear was about going insane. And I'm wondering, like, in some ways you were dogged and you were in saying no on different occasions, and of course you were punished for that. How did you keep yourself, keep your mind intact in that isolation, in that brutality, in that misery, in that hopelessness?
As it happened, I had read before that about people in a similar situation in prisons in America. And they had an alternative programme in their head where they could play football in their head. Now, I always did something else in my head, as well as resisting what was happening where I was. But I kept my brain active because I knew that that's the only cure or comfort that I had to maintain my sanity.
If it had gone on longer than it did, do you think you could have maintained that?
No, I don't. No, some of the people who came in there with me, and I'm not going to name names, ended up, in fact, two of them ended up dead the same year. And others ended up, and well, maybe passed through hospitals and so on until they arrived back, if you could say that they arrived fully back to where they were.
In terms of brutalities, okay, they neglected you on so many levels and denied you many things. Was there physical brutality aside from the hanging up, by your arms on the wall? Did you get beaten?
Generally, when that question's asked and when I answered, people will say, well, he would say that, wouldn't I? But I'm not going to do that. I am going to tell you that when I eventually got to the International Court of Human Rights in Strasburg, the committee sitting there found the British government guilty of cruel and degrading treatment. They didn't use the word torture, but they admitted and didn't contradict what we told happened during that initial period in prison. And when you ask, was it cruel and degrading, it was cruel in every way. Physical torture was used, beating was used. They were careful not to leave black marks by hitting you in the soft place that wore you down, took away all your strength, but didn't mark. And even when we came in and were weighed, the weight loss is recorded and it shows what it was.
So if they're hitting you, where are they hitting you that it doesn't leave a bruise?
The stomach, for example, was the main place. The sides, the back, all those places where you couldn't see what was happening. And one of the favourite ploys that they had was for two young men, and we were hooded at the time. I was hooded, and everybody else, because I was talking to them all afterwards, they were all hooded. And I couldn't therefore see what was taking place. But the hood slipped one time and I saw 6 young men physically, actively carrying out a programme. And what they were doing in that time that the hood slipped was holding me beside a table and trailing me along the table so that my spine was rattling and rumbling along the edge of it. Now, how is that going to show any place? That's only one example. But can I leave that description behind to say then, how people like me, who had not been involved in any violence, had been preaching against it, how people like me then could get to a stage in my mind where I would willingly have shot any of those people if I had a gun at hand and they came to me at that stage. That's the state my mind was in. Until eventually I was able to reason out what was taking place. And as my reasoning got time to improve, that I could see that those men were carrying out a programme organised by their government, I could then, through reasoning again, go back to the political situation where the government in charge allowed that to happen, or condoned that from happening, and didn't do anything about it. So that, to me then, it boiled down to political failure. And that then was something that I could contemplate going against, and arguing against, and campaigning against. So that today I could meet those people. If they came through the door today, I would invite any one of those people in and say, come in, we'll take a cup of tea together and we'll sit down. What odds about that? That's in the past. Where are you at now? Here's where I am.
How long did it take you to get to that point? Because by God Almighty, tonight, it must have taken years to come from that brutality to a place of literally come in and have a cup of tea, let's sit down and let's talk. And you know what, if you're asking for forgiveness, I'll give it to you.
All that is implied, yes, in that. But in a way, I was lucky because I had a family, as I said, of 8. I was a teacher. And I realised that if I started to carry that load of hatred and revenge and all that, not only was I going to poison myself, I was going to poison my own family, poison any of the children that I might be teaching. And I realised then, in fact, a certain lesson in the book came to my rescue, which was about a fox, pine-strong fox, until he became infested by fleas. And they sucked all his blood and left him just a skeleton, until he got the bright idea that he'd lift a mouthful of moss and back into a stream. And as the cold water rose up over his tail, over his back, on up over his shoulders, the fleas went in front of that and eventually ended up in the moss. And he opened his mouth and he let go. Now those 2 words stuck with me. Let go. So I let go. I didn't carry any of that. And I was able to face the world then through the light of reason and all that, and help from friends. And I could see things clearer that didn't entail revenge or murder or shooting. And I preached about that years afterwards, and I still do. And that to me was the way from gross injustice to being able to live with myself and enjoy life as we should do, and not carry any of that load with me. In relation to how I eventually ended up in Strasburg at the International Court of Human Rights, I wanted to say a thing or two about the beginning of that, because one of the people that I'm talking about is since dead, and the other one is still alive, an old man now. But I owe that man all I have and am at the present time, because that man came in to see me in prison under an assumed name, and I was able to tell him what happened. And he had sufficient belief in me as a truthful person to go outside and go to the government of the Irish Republic and there meet the Attorney General and bring the Attorney General in, also under an assumed name, into prison. And I was able to relay all that story to them, and they mounted a case. Because at that time the people were crying out, what is this government at? And they were crying out for an investigation, and here it was. And they took my word for what happened. And eventually we were able to prove that the truth was been told and that this happened. And as I said to you, the British government had been found guilty of inhuman and degrading treatment. Now, the important thing to me about that was that I had somebody in the outside world that had faith in me, in the story that I was telling, and that he himself was in a position where he was able to do something about it, and did. Now, that's the man that I'm talking about that's still alive. And I want to pay again, as I did often, my sincerest thanks to that man, because he risked all that he had to do that.
Why was it that he believed in you so much?
Because he believed in his own principles, and he knew that injustice was happening right across Northern Ireland, and he knew from his past life that wasn't the way to deal with it, the way it was been attempted, and he knew that he had to do something about it in light of his own conscience, and he did it. Healing
has brought you to a place of what? Describe who Paddy Joe is now. And do you think he'd be still the same person if he hadn't gone through that experience?
I'll take the last bit of that first. The answer to that is definitely no. I would not be the same person today. And the reason I say that, as anybody who's listening to this programme knows, every new experience in your life, and it doesn't have to be extreme like mine, any new experience in your life changes you and me from the person I was yesterday, and I'm a different person today. Now, I may not realise that, but that is the effect of any experience. And the more difficult the experience, the greater the change. So now, when I listen to and hear myself talk and hear other people and I read about that, I don't look to the bad side of that. I can say now, wasn't I fortunate that came through that experience and was able to bear up and had the strength to do what I did. And I am in a position now where I can be reasonably content in my own mind and say, well, you didn't resort to intervention, you didn't do all that. What would it have been like if you had done that now? Wouldn't you be doing the very same thing as you're talking about those people doing to you? So I was extremely fortunate and all that. And I'm a different person today than I would have been then. I attribute a lot of it to the fact that I was a pretty reasonably good footballer. And the contests that we had on the fields of Tyrone led you to believe that you could conquer most things if you stuck at it. So that, and I would be called now, I suppose, physically handicapped, in that I would be about 5'4" or 5, and good footballers then were 6'6". So even then, I could see that I could win out if I stuck to what I wanted to do and give it all that I could give it. So I built up, or it was built up in me, a resilience to face what might be seen as odds against you. So I think that that's what gave me that I did not at any time give in to what was been done to me. And how do I feel today? I said to you a while ago, I feel that I'm the luckiest man alive today. And part of my luck was having that happen to me. Now, I wouldn't volunteer for this, or wouldn't advise anybody to volunteer to go through that, but as it happened, and as I did come through it, and as it influenced me in so many ways, I am one of the luckiest men alive today. That's how I view that.
Paddy Joe McLean, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.